Can you believe it's already almost September? Oh my gosh, next week is already Labor Day weekend. Literally blows my mind. But as you guys know, winter is coming very, very fast for us beekeepers. So it's really important what we do right now to prepare our hives. So I decided to kind of take it back a little bit. So a year ago, I gave a class about overwintering, different ways of using treatment and being treatment free, and walkaway splits. And in that class, I made a PowerPoint and went over a lot of really good and important information that I never really got to share with you guys. So I decided it would be perfect for me to just kind of put this PowerPoint on play and walk you through my whole entire method of how to overwinter, all the different ways that you can treat for Varroa mites. So if you're a new beekeeper, this will be very beneficial for you to listen to. And I also talk about briefly some of the things I do to be treatment free. And also at the end, I do touch on walkaway splits and what it's like to do a walkaway split in Michigan, and if you should do them, if you shouldn't do them, you know, all the juicy details. So stay tuned. And I guess that's it. Let's start the video. Alright, so overwintering, treatment-free, and walkaway splits. So first and foremost, as you guys know, I live in Michigan in the Lower Peninsula, and our winters can be very unpredictable. Sometimes it can be really cold and have a lot of snow. Other times we could have a warmer but more damp winter that's going to bring in a lot of dampness and humidity into our hives. But usually, lucky enough, we do have winter that is good enough for occasional cleansing flights in November and December, and also in March and April. I know there are some other states that aren't really able to do this, so there are times that their bees can be in the colony for around like 4 or 5 months, which is quite a while because those bees, they do need to use the bathroom, and in order for them to do that, they have to be able to leave the hive in order to go on a cleansing flight. And that can really, really impact the health of the colony if they're not able to do that. So I definitely consider myself lucky that Michigan, at least where I'm at, they are able to still take those cleansing flights. But you know how the weather is. It's always changing, especially in today's world, so you never know. But January through February are our coldest months, and usually the daytime highs are in the single digits with snow. We've had a couple years in the past that have had like -20, -30 wind chill. I'm not even kidding. I wish I was. A lot of people's cars wouldn't start. And that was really hard on the bees. The ones that did survive, those are the ones you want. But the trees, there's a lot of trees in the area that I'm at, and the trees really help block wind and prevent bad whiteout blizzard conditions. That way you don't have colonies looking like you see here, just completely encased in snow. But even if you do, that's okay because snow does actually insulate your colony. So it'll help keep it a little bit warmer. The main key is that they need a little bit of an area to be able to get some airflow, but usually they will fan the hot air from the hive out through that. That's why it's beneficial to have an upper entrance, and they'll form like a little tunnel of like going through the snow so they can get some of that air. Kind of cool. And then, yeah, I talk about the polar vortex, which we already spoke about. But in March, it warms up a little bit more, some 30-degree days. And by April, we're looking at 40 to 50 degrees. But the only downside is there's usually a lot of rain. Usually March through April is pretty wet, so there's not anything blooming yet. And it can still be pretty cold when it's that wet because it's not the cold that kills bees, it's wet cold that kills bees. So they really need to be able to help lower their moisture levels when it is that damp outside. But March and April is usually a hit or miss. Some years it is perfect for the bees, and other years it is cold and rainy. This last year was kind of a little bit of both, to be honest. So I made this PowerPoint a year ago, and the year prior to that, so 2 years ago, it was super crazy cold and wet. But this last year, it warmed up. It was super warm throughout the first half of, was it March? No, I think it was April. But then all of a sudden we got a really bad cold snap that just completely halted and stopped everything. And then after that we started getting our dandelions blooming and whatnot. But overall though, March and April is really a hit or miss. So the years that we have a good April, those are the years that we have some really good flows. So as I mentioned, dandelions are the first to bloom, and this is the first sign that the flow is here. That is the first flower that's really going to put out a substantial nectar source for the bees, for them to start bringing in and start ramping up. And you'll be able to tell it's coming because your bees know before you know. So usually the bees, they'll tend to swarm right before right before the flow hits. Because they know that they're going to be able to set their hive up if they do swarm. So that's why they time it that way, so they do have those resources. But you'll start to see your hives really ramp up, and as you know, in the springtime, that's when they want to swarm. So you'll start to see them start shooting out some little queen cups. And at that point, if you let them keep going, and they still keep expanding so quickly, the next step is they're going to start putting eggs in those queen cups. I'm not saying queen cups is the tell, because they will just put queen cups just to put queen cups in a colony. But if you have a high number of bees, a ton of capped brood, and you see these queen cups, oh yeah, as soon as that capped brood emerges, there's going to be eggs in those cups, like I promise you. But anyways, so the next to bloom is the fruit trees, if they're not killed by frost. A lot of our apple trees was killed this last year. And the last frost date, at least for where I'm at in Michigan, is usually sometime mid-May. Then the clover and the alfalfa and the milkweed start to bloom. Then our favorite, the black locust trees, start to bloom right before going into, I wouldn't really say our fall flow. I need to change that. I would say more so going into our summer flow. Because yes, the black locust trees, they can put out a ton of nectar. So the picture that you see here, this is actually a black locust tree, and they will be completely encased in flowers. Also, ignore any squeaking you hear in the background. That is my chair. But okay. So just another kind of freebie to throw out there. So this time of year in August, a really big nectar source that I keep seeing everywhere, is a bush called Japanese knotweed. It is very invasive, so don't seek to plant it out, as it is nearly impossible to get rid of. But if you ever see any in your area, this is a picture of it. The bees will be all over it, and they make a really a dark and really good honey out of it, and they put off, like, those bushes can get up to like 12 feet tall. So if it's a really big bush, they can put out at least like 100,000 flower heads. So yeah, they can be a really big source for honeybees this time of year in August. So if you do see some, I would definitely put some hives next to them. And I also have a flow schedule for Michigan. I will also put a link in the description for this so you can pull it up on your phone. I've used this many times as I've been kind of trying to learn when the flows hit, what's actually hitting, what kind of nectar sources are actually coming in. But yeah, so go check this out. I'll have the link in the description. So timing your bees with the flow is extremely important for overwintering. And yes, of course it's really important for getting a lot of honey. But the reason I'm telling you all this about the flow is because if you don't have those built up stores, your bees are not going to make it through the winter time. So in order to overwinter successfully, you first need a good population size, you need enough food stores, and you also need a way of preventing moisture buildup, and you need good genetics, and lastly, you need low mite loads. So first, let's talk about colony populations. If there's too large of a space for a small cluster, you're going to end up having dead bees. And that is because, yes, the bees do only heat their cluster and keep their cluster warm, but any of the outside air is also going to affect how hard they have to work to keep their cluster warm. So if you have a lot of space, that's going to be a lot of air and buffer that's going to be coming at them, because the honey, the frames, and the wood all acts as a form of insulation. So the less space you have, if you only have as much space as they need, that's going to be more beneficial for them versus having, like, say 3 or 4 deeps on them. Now, I have been reading and I have been seeing some recent videos of people doing experiments on this, and they're like, hey, actually the bees do survive. But really, it's all different for every single beekeeper. So just for the way that I like to manage my hives, I generally do not want to have more than just a second deep on top. I've overwintered in singles before. I've overwintered in 5-frame double-story nukes before, but I would not recommend overwintering with like 3 boxes on them. I just feel like that's too much. They really don't need that much anyways. So yeah. And population is super important in helping generate heat to keep the cluster warm. If the cluster is too small, they won't be able to generate enough heat to rear brood in December and February. And it's important for the timing of how long each bee will survive. So if there aren't enough bees to take care of the brood in October and December, the queen is not going to lay as much, meaning there isn't going to be enough bees in February to keep the bees warm and tend to the brood in order to build up for the spring flow. So that ends up making the colony collapse, because the bees, they know how many bees they have and how many mouths there will be to feed all of the baby bees. I'm not really explaining that well. It requires bees to then raise the next generation. So if there's not a high number of bees in that colony, they're not going to be able to produce that many baby bees because there won't be enough mouths to feed the baby bees. So having a high population going into winter is really, really, really important for that. Because naturally their colony size is going to go down anyways. So the second most important thing is to have enough food stores. So this can tie into how large your cluster will be in October, because if you don't have a whole lot of food stores, then they're going to shrink their cluster, because I noticed that they're smart. They look around their hive and they see what they all have in terms of resources, and they start to make plans and decide, okay, we only have this many resources, so that means we can only have a cluster size this big. Otherwise, we're going to run out of food in, say, January or February. And they'll plan accordingly. So this is also why I usually say that I would never start going in and combining small colonies together anytime after September. Really, the first or second week of September, I would just cut it off. And even then, that's pushing it for me. I usually like to have everything set by the end of August so that they have that time to then start making plans and hit that last fall flow and start planning their winter prep and everything. Otherwise, like I said, you combine 2 colonies together, now you have a big colony, but now that hive, say, doesn't have as much food stores. So now they're like, shoot, now what do we do? We're not going to make it if we're all still here because there's only so many food stores. So yeah, but it is crucial to have a good amount of food by mid-September, because if not, the queen will not lay as many eggs, meaning less winter bees and less numbers in the colony. Bees base their cluster size off of how much food they have, so they will not make more brood or bees than they can feed. So my mistakes that I've made in the past. So I saw firsthand that what happens in October when your bees do not have enough food. I had recently moved my hives from a previous location, which was pretty much a nectar desert. I was in a really rural area on the outside of town. So a lot of just like green grass lawns, or like monocropped like soybean fields or corn fields, not a whole lot of wildflower fields, which is what they really needed, or like plots of trees that had like flowers on it and whatnot. There were some mulberry trees, so that did help, but I didn't time my splits with the flows well last, this was 2 years ago. I hadn't timed my splits with the flows very well, so it was all definitely a learning experience. I had really tried doing splits in August and making up all those double story 5-frame nukes that you guys saw, and I definitely paid for it last winter. Took some pretty big losses because they didn't have enough food. They also didn't regulate their moisture very well. I built those nukes myself, and they were all somehow having like leaks in them. So I would open up a colony and it'd just be soaking wet with water up top from the lids, because the lids would start to bow. So yeah, we're definitely going to figure out something with that this year because we are utilizing some of those hive boxes. So, but anyways, so not enough food, I think, is largely why a lot of colonies collapse in October and December. We pull our cut of honey off in August and September when it is crucial that the bees have enough food to maintain a good population. So it sends them into like sort of like a stress response. So now you're causing your bees to have to work way harder than they need to. And by that time, you have winter bees with a large fat body. So they're going to start depleting that fat body, and they're going to work way harder than they need to get the colony ready. And at that point, then as the winter progresses, they're not going to be as strong as they need to be in order to survive. And if a colony has an abundance of food, then it is easier to overcome viruses and other ailments. Like Cayman Reynolds always says, the most important things are low mite loads, good nutrition, and did he say good genetics, I think is the last one? But the low mite loads and good nutrition, really the good nutrition, if they have a lot of resources in food stores, then they can honestly combat anything. They can combat any viruses, any mites that they have, because the mites feed on them. They feed on their fat body and suck the nutrients out of them pretty much. So if they have enough food stores, they're going to be able to fight off any of the viruses that also the Varroa mites give them. Because I mean, just like us, we get sick, and the most important thing is to take your vitamins, we all say. Same thing goes with bees. So, and I think I talk about this right here. Think of us as humans. When we are sick, we try to get in as many nutrients as possible. We take a multivitamin, drink some chicken broth. Also, we can fight off the sickness that we may have. Bees are similar in that aspect. If they are starving, they won't be strong enough to fight off any viruses because the mites had weakened the bees. They no longer had the nutrients that they had before, so those viruses can really prey on the bees and end up killing them. Plus, you want your winter bees to be fed well so that they are strong and have a longer lifespan throughout the wintertime. So, how much food do they actually need? They need 80 to 90 pounds for double deeps. They need 60 to 70 pounds for single deeps, and 50 pounds for a double stack 5-frame nuke. The reason it's different for each one is because you're going to have a different cluster size based off of the size that you put them in. So if you want to, and you're a newer beekeeper and you just want to play it safe, something that you can do is you can throw on a backup sugar candy board on top of the frames if needed. Now there's a lot of recipes online that you can use. You can kind of like mold it into like a board. You can measure it out how large your the top of your boxes, and you can like make them in the oven, mix them with like, I believe it's like vinegar and some other things and sugar. But the way that I like to do it, super plain and simple, and it works great. And all that is I just get a really big mixing bowl. I put in some sugar, I put in a little bit of water, and then I take a fork and I mix it all around until it makes, it looks like the consistency of wet sand. Then I'll put it on top of the hive and mold it how I want to, and it will harden, yes, but then the bees, they will add moisture that they get from the hive, because in the winter time, it's cold on the outside of the hive, and that's going to create condensation when that clashes with the heat on the inside of the hive. So they're going to have that little bit of moisture, which you actually need that to happen because bees do actually need water. And they'll use that to then soften and like kind of like dissolve that sugar so that they can then take it in. Now, if you really want to be simple with it, the way that Casey likes to do it is he just puts down a piece of newspaper and he just does mountain camp method, which is just literally pouring dry sugar right on top of it. And by him doing this, that absorbs all of the moisture in the colony so that he doesn't have to put on like the styrofoam boards that I use, which I will show you later in the video. He doesn't use those whatsoever. He just uses that mountain camp because that soaks up all the moisture for him. So this is a picture from, I believe this was after my first winter. And so this was a hive that did not have enough food stores going into winter or coming out of winter. Now this hive surprisingly actually made it. But they were really struggling all year because they were not able to build up that really large colony size to really hit that first flow. So they were struggling really from the get. So this is what happens when they don't have enough food. They won't all die at once. They will slowly just try to shrink the cluster size as much as possible so that they can actually still survive as a colony. So that's the actually really cool thing about bees is that they care more about the colony survival, not their personal selves survival. So they do everything that they possibly can just to make sure that their genetics are what is passed on and that, like I said, they survive. Okay, so number 3, moisture prevention. Wet cold is what kills bees, not dry cold. Have you ever been to Florida on a 40-degree day? You would think that 40 degrees isn't bad, but add in the humidity and it will feel like a deep cold that literally chills you to your bones. Damp air transfers heat more rapidly from your body. That's a rule of thermodynamics. The more humid it is in the colony, the harder the bees have to work to stay warm, which means they're also going to be expelling more energy, and that's going to cause a higher food store consumption. So moisture is really, really crucial to helping your colony not only use less food stores, but also be able to survive and not, as some would say, freeze to death. Whenever you go into a colony and you see that they're kind of like icy, it's probably because there's a high moisture level and they weren't able to fight it. So if it's too cold and damp, then the wet air will freeze the bees. See, it's like I already knew what I was going to say. Especially if the colony does not have a large cluster. So how does the moisture get there in the first place? I kind of briefly already talked about this. But when the cold top of the hive clashes with the warm inside of the hive, this creates condensation that will drip onto the cluster. That's not good because if you're super cold and all of a sudden you have cold water dripping onto you, they can't get warm. So those bees are going to end up freezing and dying. And when bees actually do produce moisture themselves. So fun fact, bees actually do breathe. And when they exhale, they produce moisture and it goes into the hive. So the reasons why this is actually one of the main reasons why it is essential to have an upper entrance so that they can then get all of that moisture out of the hive. Now, I did do a experiment a few years ago, and you see, the problem with this experiment is I tried multiple different ways of overwintering your bees. I tried some with a open bottom board, a screen bottom board with a upper entrance, so it'd create like a chimney-like effect. And then I did another hive that had no upper entrance and the whole entire bottom entrance open without any reducers in it whatsoever. And then I did another one that had an upper entrance and a very tiny bottom entrance and a solid bottom board. And the problem was every single one of them survived. So you could have an upper entrance, you could not have an upper entrance. But for areas where it gets really cold and you have a lot of snow, an upper entrance could be crucial for you, just because when that snow starts to stack up at the bottom of your hive, it's going to block that bottom entrance, so they're not going to be able to get out for cleansing flights like I had talked about previously. So an upper entrance will really help with that, especially if you live someplace that you can get like 3 feet of snow, 4 feet of snow. Honestly, it's probably going to be crucial for you. But hot air from the bees will make a chimney through the snow, forming a small tunnel for air to come in and out. An upper entrance also essential for cleansing flights when snow is blocking the bottom board, like I mentioned. So the best thing to use for moisture prevention, what I like to use is 1-inch thick foam placed right underneath the lid on top of a feeder cover or shim with an upper entrance notched in the wood. That way, any moisture that's produced by the bees is going to go up to the feed that I put on top, the candy board that I put on top, and then any condensation that is also produced from the lid is not going to happen because of that foam. So it's going to make it so that the cold and the hot does not clash whatsoever, because insulation foam, it has a way of wicking moisture and helps trap in heat. This is why we use foam to make cheap coolers and to insulate our homes. So when I'm thinking about a beehive, I like to think about it as if it's a house. And the way we insulate our houses is we like to put something that's going to keep the hot air on the inside we're producing from clashing with the cold air on the outside, so that we have a super dry home with absolutely no moisture problems. That's the ideal, at least. And beehives are the exact same way. So that's why I like using the foam. I found it works absolutely great. I did experiment with using a 1/2-inch foam, and I would not do that. I would not go any less than 3/4 of an inch for foam, if you're going to use that underneath your lids. So yeah. All right. So the fourth most important thing, this is why it is super important to buy bees that are local to your area. And that is, you want to have good genetics. So this allows bees to use less food if you have good genetics. And it also determines how much energy they expend. Silent bees, when you put your ear up to the hive midwinter, is exactly what you want. You don't want the bees that you can hear humming, because that means that they're moving around, they're consuming food, and they're not actually hibernating like you want them to be. You don't want to hear a single peep, especially if you live in a northern climate. And the genetics is also going to determine when they start building up in the spring and when they start shutting down in the fall. So bees that are not adapted to a northern climate, I've noticed it's like they don't expect winter to come. So it's like they're just ramped up the whole entire time going through the fall time. They're eating a super in like a week because they're just going so crazy. That might be a little extreme, but like they definitely can if they want to. I've seen it before. And it's like they don't even know the winter is about to come. So then winter comes and they're like, oh shoot. And then all of a sudden they're dead by December because they didn't prep well, they didn't have enough food, they just kept buzzing around like crazy, and they just did not know how to withstand the winters. So genetics in that aspect are going to be really important. You want to have a bee that's adapted. And even then, I generally like to have my hive underneath the queen that they're going to overwinter with by August 1st. That way, I've noticed that it really makes a difference in whether or not the colony survives, because they're all working in unison. Whereas if you have like bees from like multiple different genetics, it seems like they just don't work well together, and like sometimes they just do not perform well. Now, I might just be reading into it way too much, but that's just something that I've noticed. But it also determines if they're going to be superior foragers, which could be very important because it's going to determine how much honey they bring in, and that's going to determine how much food stores they have for the winter as well. And being able to manage mites will also help prevent colony collapse in the fall. So there's some hives I've seen that literally they have 3 mites one week, and then you come back like 3 weeks later, and all of a sudden they have 30 in a wash, and they just cannot withstand mites whatsoever. And then there's other bees where I'll see they'll have 4 mites in a wash, 3 mites in a wash, 5 mites in a wash. They'll just kind of like teeter-totter back and forth. Those are the bees that you want. So genetics can really make a difference on how your bees are going to overwinter. Because you, like I keep saying, you want them to use the least amount of food so that they don't have to have a ton of food on there, because honey's expensive. You want to be able to pull your honey off, because that's why you have bees. You don't want bees that need a ton of resources. So yeah, genetics are extremely important. The next thing that actually, the last thing that is probably one of the most important things for bees going into the winter is having low mite loads. It's something that I focused on in the past, but as I move into the treatment-free realm, my genetic selection will manage this and has been managing this. But it is still very, very important, and here's why. So why are the bees affected by Varroa? When the mite attaches itself to the bee, it pokes a microscopic hole in the bee's exoskeleton and begins feeding on the bee's hemolymph. The hemolymph, well, hold on, actually, let me back up. Okay, I made this PowerPoint a year ago, but since then there's actually new research that has came out. So I actually, hold on a second, I'm going to completely cross out this slide and verbally explain to you what the new research is actually showing. And that is that the bees, they have a fat body. That is what differentiates winter bees from summer bees, is they have a larger fat body that's going to help them have energy to carry them through the winter time. And in that fat body is something called vitellogenin. You've heard me talk about it before. It is extremely important because it is what they use to produce brood food in the late winter months in February, when they really start ramping up their hive cluster, but there's no pollen sources coming in, and say that they've already used up a lot of their pollen stores that they had ready for them. They really rely on that vitellogenin to be able to produce that protein and turn it into brood food to give to them. Also, vitellogenin is their energy reserve. So if they have a low level of this because the mites have been feeding on it, they're not going to be able to survive as long. So they're going to have a shorter lifespan on top of that during a time when the bees need to survive as long as they can, because winter bees can survive for up to like 5 or 6 months in some areas. They're the bees that live the longest out of all of the bees, whereas summer bees, they only survive for around 4 to 6 weeks. So it's really important they have their whole life cycle, their whole lifespan in the wintertime so that they can actually survive. And also, vitellogenin is also responsible for, it makes an immune transport. So say a bee has a virus. Have you ever gone into a hive and noticed that it was like the bees were literally eating the heads off of the baby bees, off of the brood? And the reason for this is they're going to go and take that virus in through their mouth because that brood was infected. And through the vitellogenin immune transport, they're then able to kind of like turn it into a sort of vaccine, I guess you could call it. I know it's like so scary to say that word nowadays, so hopefully YouTube does not flag this, but it turns it into that so that they can then feed it through the brood food to the brood, to the next generation of bees, so that hopefully they can become immune to that virus. So vitellogenin is crazy, crazy cool, but this is exactly what the mites feed on. So you can see how the mites can really, really hurt a colony because it makes them weak in an immune response way. It makes them weak in a way of not having enough nutrients or enough energy reserves. And it makes them weak so that they're not able to raise the next round of brood. So it ends up collapsing the colony. So think of it like this. If we had a parasite, we would be weak and sick often. We would no longer be able to fight viruses very well. We would be nutrient deficient and our lifespan would shorten. This is exactly what is happening to our honeybees. So what happens to that hole the mite poked into the bee when the mite hops off. Because remember, I did say the Varroa mites do poke a microscopic hole in the bee's exoskeleton that cannot heal, because their exoskeleton does not heal like our skin does as humans. So that's the thing. Nothing happens. And when that happens, then it's left open for anything to just find their way into the bee. Any virus, any bacteria, any microorganism, any microbe, anything can find its way into the bee and make it sick. So just like if we break our skin and we get a cut, we become susceptible to any viruses we come in contact with. Except for most of us, our immune system is able to withstand and fight any invaders, but when your immune system is weak because you have been parasitized, you don't have anything to fight back. So you get an infection or you get really, really sick, and this is why our honeybees are struggling so badly to overcome these viruses, because the mites weaken them to a point that they literally can't do anything. They're defenseless. So I feel like all I'm saying is very like negative and scary things, but that Varroa mites are our enemy as beekeepers. If you haven't learned that yet, now you know. And the other reason for this is, so not only do they weaken our bees, but guess what? They're smart too. And that is, and the way that they are is because they're able to time their whole reproduction cycle with the timing of the bee's season in their life cycle. So it's timed perfectly to prey on the bees when their numbers are dwindling. Throughout the summer, the mice continue to breed and multiply. And as that happens, once we start getting around like August, when the hive it prepares for its last fall flow, so it has really high hive numbers. At that point, the Varroa mites are really, really high because they've already had the entire summer to just keep reproducing and reproducing so that they can get a really good hold on the hive. Well, then the bees start to decrease their numbers because they're preparing for wintertime. And when that happens, the bees decrease, but the mites, they don't decrease. In fact, they keep increasing. They keep reproducing. So what was originally maybe one mite every 10 bees, now it's one mite every 7, every 5, and then every 3. And then all of a sudden, by the time you hit November, there's a mite on every single bee. So every single bee is becoming weakened. Every single bee is infected with the virus. And then by the end of December, usually if you have a hive that collapses by the before the new year, that is because it collapsed because of Varroa mites. Because at that point, the bees are too weak that they cannot withstand the high mite loads anymore. So that's how the Varroa mites really kind of prey. Actually, they really prey on the honeybees. So that's why you always hear too that it's so important to make sure you have your bees have a low mite count going into wintertime. Because not only that, but when your bees are producing winter bees, you want those bees to be strong. And if they're infested with mites because your numbers were really, really high, they're not going to have that high level of vitellogenin like I was talking about, and they're not going to be strong enough to make it through the whole winter time. And then I go on a little bit down here talking about how the adult female Varroa has a lifespan of around 2 months, which is quite a while. Whereas summer bees can sometimes only last between 15 to 38 days. Winter bees actually 150 to 200 days. So they last a little bit longer. So that's actually a good thing. They do have that winter time. I would be curious to see, do southern beekeepers have more problems with Varroa mites than us northern beekeepers do? Because the cool thing is about having a winter for our bees is they do go through that broodless period, and that interrupts the mite's life cycle, their reproduction cycle, sorry. So that they then are not able to have any food and reproduce, because the mites, they require the bees' brood cells and an actual active larva in there growing in order for them to reproduce and for their babies, their baby mites to be able to feed. So if they don't have any brood in the hive, the mites aren't able to reproduce, and so that clock starts to tick of like how long the bees are going to live. And on top of that, Then once you have that first round of brood, all the mites then flood the cells, and there's more mites per cell than there normally would be. So they end up, yes, killing the brood, because what happens is there's not enough food in that cell from that larva, that baby bee that's in there, to then feed all of the baby mites that are in that cell. So they end up starving to death, and that really, really helps take that mite level down. That's what a brood break does. That's what a lot of us treatment-free beekeepers like to use as a brood break, and that's why we use brood breaks. It's actually kind of cool because I was just in a hive a couple weeks ago, and this hive had requeened itself. And after the new queen was back, she had her first round of brood. So I was like, okay, she's probably laying now. I'm going to go in and see what's going on. I go in there and I'm like, oh no, this hive looks like it has one of the worst brood diseases I've ever seen. And I'm like, this isn't European foul brood. This isn't American foul brood. I'm seeing a lot of bald brood. I'm seeing some chewed down heads, and I'm seeing some like smushed, like little larvae like laying vertically on the edge of the cell. So I'm like, what could this be? This isn't any of the brood diseases I know. So I just closed it up and was like, probably not the best thing to do, but I closed it up and was like, okay, I will think on this and I will come back because I don't really know what I should do with this right now. I then come back a week later and I'm like, whoa, you can't even tell this hive had a brood disease anymore. They cleaned up all the cells. All the cells are perfectly capped and looking all nice and pretty. So what I was seeing there is that those, that hive, the Varroa mites, had taken out that first round of brood, which, yes, that sucks, but now you have lower mite levels so that the next round of brood can perform a lot better. Okay, so say by August, there are 1,000 mites total in a single colony. When your colony is of full size for the flows, the bees can handle this because the ratio of bees to mites is very high. So say there are 30,000 bees in the hive during the flow. That put you at a mite load of 3% or 10 mites in a wash, right at the threshold to treat. Come September, though, the colony begins to shrink in preparation for winter time. So the bees die off, but none of the mites do. In fact, they actually keep breeding. So this is why when I was treating, because I have treated in the past, so I have utilized what is out there, and I've learned a lot about it. Don't really like what it does to the bees, so that's why I've drifted more towards treatment-free and also trying to raise good genetics that can withstand Varroa on their own, because otherwise we're propping up weak genetics. But anyways, I'm not getting into that spiel. But so when I was treating my hives, if I went into a hive in August and I saw their mite load was at that 3%, oh yeah, I am treating. Actually, if I see that mite load is at 2%, I am also treating. That is because, like I said, when the bees start to decrease their cluster size, there's going to be more mites per bee, so that mite load is going to skyrocket, which a lot of people will say, oh no, this is because there was a mite bomb that happened. When actually, I don't know, mite bombs can happen, but I've always just noticed that when the cluster size goes down like that, it can seem like a mite bomb happened, but really what happened is there's less bees, there's more mites per bees. So yeah, keep that in mind. So say by October, the colony then shrinks by 50%. Now you've got a 6% mite load or 20 mites in a wash. Now there's really an issue because more bees have mites on them. The colony weakens and bees start to die off. Now the colony has shrunk by 75%, putting the mite load at 12% or 40 mites in a wash. At this point, every single bee has a mite on it, and don't forget, the mites, they're still breeding and have been this entire time. So when this happens, the colony collapses because it cannot get strong enough to fight back. So in this picture, you see on the drone bee right in there, there's a little orangish brown saucer on its back, and that is a Varroa mite. When you start seeing Varroa mites on your bees, you're in trouble. Especially this time of year, it can be pretty common for you to see that. And if you do, your mite levels are probably pretty high because Varroa mites, they like to hide in the on the exoskeleton of the bee. So a bee has plates on it that help it to like flex and whatnot. And the Varroa mites will hide right underneath those plates so that you can barely even see them. And they prefer to be on their belly where the fat body is. So by the time you start seeing Varroa mites on your bees, you know that's bad, because they for some reason could not get onto the underbelly of the bee. So now they're on top of the bee. So this is exactly why you want to check your mite load, and you want it to be as low as possible by the first week of September. That way the bees have a head start on the mites. And also the bees' broodless period, January through mid-February, does help slow the reproduction of more mites. This is why I really wonder, do southern beekeepers, do they have more problems with mites than us northern beekeepers do? Because they don't really get, do they get that broodless period? Because it is warmer. So I don't know. Southern beekeepers, reach out. I'm curious. I want to know. But okay, now we're going to get into treatments. So for your new beekeepers, you're really going to listen to this part. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is formic acid, and I'm going to talk about the pros and the cons. I've used this a lot, and this is one of the things that I used to absolutely swear by. And for new beekeepers, this is what I usually tend to lean towards saying, hey, you should use formic if you're just now starting beekeeping and you're trying to learn how mites and all that work, because it's super easy to apply. And it's also really effective, and it also kills mites inside the cell of a bee and outside the cell of a bee, the ones that are on the bee, which is really important. But okay, I'm going to give away everything I have in this slide, so let me just start reading it. So formic acid, the pros are that it kills phoretic mites, which are the mites that are found on bees. And it kills fonderous mites, which are the mites that are found in the cell. Not every single treatment does this. This is the only treatment that does that. That's why formic acid is so popular. It does not leave any residues in the wax or honey, so it is approved to use with honey supers on. And it's an organic compound that's found naturally in honey. A full dose is only a 10-day treatment. You only have to do it once. You don't have to do it over a month-long period like a lot of the other treatments do. And it's easy to apply, and it's sold as pads for you to place on the lower brood box and will release gases over the 10 days. The first 3 days are the most effective. Now, the cons of formic acid is it is one of the most harsh treatments on the bees, as it makes the hive extremely hot. It can burn and kill your brood. I've seen it many times before. That's why I don't like it. And it also runs the risk of possibly killing your queen or making them abscond. I've never had that happen, but I've heard about it from some beekeepers. And you can only use it between the temps of 55 degrees and 85 degrees. So this makes it really hard to use in the summertime, especially in those later months, and especially if you live in one of the southern states, because if it's not underneath 85 degrees, then it's going to end up killing your hive. It's going to, well, not kill your hive. It's going to cause a lot of damage. It's going to kill your brood. Because that's the one thing that I really noticed is if I use it when it's like more towards like the 60 to 70 degree range, I don't see any bad effects on my hive. But when I used it, it was like 80, 81 degrees for those first 3 days. And oh my gosh, it burned so much brood. Now it might also be because that hive was also in the sun, so it actually made the hive hotter than what it actually was outside. But if you're close to that 85 degree mark during those first 3 days, I would really be careful. And the reason I'm saying those first 3 days is because, like I said, that is when it is the most effective, and it's at the strongest part of the acid. So those first 3 days are crucial, that it's, in my opinion, at least under 80 degrees. Unless you have a hive in the shade, you could probably get away with 85. But yeah, those first 3 days is when you really want your temperature to be in range. Anything after that, you can kind of like, you can ballpark it and you'll be fine, because it's mostly it's released most of the gases during those first 3 days. Also, it can be pretty expensive over time, as it is $90 for a pack of 10 doses. So if you're treating like 2 times, 3 times a year, that can be quite a bit. So this is what it looks like. like I said, you just put it on the lower brood box. You put one on the front corner and one on the back corner so that they are diagonal to each other. And as you can see, look at where the bees are on the hive. The moment I put these on the hive, they all start vibrating a lot more like aggressively. They're just like nice and humming, and then you put them on there and they're like all crazy. So you know they definitely do not like them whatsoever. So yeah, that's how you'd place them on, and then you just put your top box on top of that, close it up. Make sure you have good ventilation. That is very important. The bees need to be able to fan out any of the heat and the acid out of the hive, so you want to have your bottom board completely open. And if you want to, also feel free to like crack a little bit of, well, actually you don't have to do that. Just make sure the bottom board is completely open. You don't have like an entrance reducer in or something, so that they actually can circulate the air that they need to. All right. Appavar. This is one of the most popular treatments. And first and foremost, I'm not really a fan of it, but before I tell you about that, let me tell you about Appavar. So it only kills phoretic mites, so the mites on the bees, so you must leave it in for 6 weeks. It's easy to apply, it's sold as strips, but it is a chemical treatment, not organic. So it does leave residues, and it is not approved to be used with your honey supers on, because it will leach into your honey. Mites are building resistance to it, and my mites, the reason I don't like them is they do not respond whatsoever to Appavar. I will put Appavar in a hive and I will count on it to have taken the mite load down. I come back at the 6 weeks and I test my mites, and they haven't budged. In fact, they've actually increased. So yeah, I did not like that. So that's why I try to stay away from it now, just because of how much resistance the mites are building to it. But some people do have a lot of success with it. So again, that's how beekeeping is as a whole, though, is that every beekeeper has their own experiences, and we all have our own way of doing things. So as always, take what I say as just like additional information. Don't take it as hardcore truth and fact to how it has to be done. You just take in what I say and take in what other people say, and then you just kind of make your own beekeeping method around it. But it works by placing 2 strips between brood frames, and the bees will rub against it, and it will leave a residue on their body that they will then rub off onto other bees until all of the bees in the hive have came in contact with the active ingredient called amitraz. These are what they look like. They have a little flap on them. The way that I like to put them in a colony is, you see how there's like a little hole at the top up here? I will put like a little piece of dried up stick in there, and I will just place it right in between 2 frames and let that stick then hold it, because it'll go across the frames, the stick will, and it will hold it there between the frames so that the bees can then go on either side of it. The important part is you need to make sure that the bees are able to go on either side of it, and you don't put it on a piece of comb that's like overextended so that it's pushed up against a wall or something. And you want to put it in between some of like the frames in the middle of the hive, so that is where all of the brood is coming out. There's going to be a lot of bees going in and out to take care of that brood, so you're going to have the most amount of action when you have it in that area. All right, so the next way of treating is apiguard. I do not personally have any experience using it, but I have heard many beekeepers say that using apiguard followed by a brood break will completely decimate the mites. So it's sold as gel packs that you place on the top of the bottom brood box in a hive, and the thymol gel will stink up the hive, causing the bees to try to remove it. And when they do this, the gel will cover the worker bees and inadvertently disperse it throughout the hive. As every single bee like bumps into one another, it transfers until every single bee has it. It is an organic compound that is derived from a plant called thyme. And the temp ranges for this are 60 to 100 degrees. The hotter it is, the better it works. So it works great for summertime, but not so great for fall and springtime. It is not approved for use with honey supers on, and it only kills phoretic mites, mites that are on the bee. So it must be used over a long duration with the brood break in order to really knock back the mites. Another treatment this is actually my favorite treatment to use, and if I ever treat again, which most likely that's not going to happen unless I have like a pollination yard somewhere that is in close proximity to other bees, because that's a really big problem for people who get involved with pollination, is when you have your bees next to other people's bees, some people don't take care of their bees or they don't have good genetics, so you will find that mite bomb problem start to happen. I've heard many people complain about it before, where the bees will then start transferring mites, and all the flower sites are going to have mites on them because other bees had mites on them and they brought them there. So it can be a problem. But anyways, okay, I'm getting off topic. Oxalic acid is my favorite way of treating, and it is approved for use in a vaporizer to gas a hive, or you can mix it into a solution and drip it onto the bees between frames, called the dribble method. There is another treatment that I don't even know if I'm allowed to talk about, because I believe it was approved, but then they took that back and it's no longer approved, I think. But there were these OA pads that a lot of people were using, Cayman Reynolds, and there was another beekeeper. I'm going to have to look it up and put it on the screen. But they have been doing a lot. I think it was Randy Oliver. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Randy Oliver. They were, well, no, I don't know. I'll put it up on the screen. They were doing a lot of research with this, and it was these pads that they would then soak up this oxalic acid gel that they would make, and they would just put it in a hive, and they would always have them in the hive, and they worked as kind of like preventative maintenance of Varroa mites, so that it would then just kill mites whenever they came in contact in that hive. But oxalic acid is a organic compound, and it is the gentlest treatment on the market for bees. That is why I like it. It occurs naturally in leafy greens and legumes. And once you invest in a good vaporizer, in the long run, it is the cheapest treatment to use, because oxalic acid, you can get like a 50-pound bag for like, I gotta say, like $30. Like, it's really not that much, and that will last you a really long time. But the vaporizer works by heating up crystals or powder, which will then dissolve into a gas. If you place it in the bottom of an entrance, or the way that I did it before is I was using a vaporizer that a really awesome follower had made himself. I'll put up a video of it. And you just drill a hole in the back of your hive, and then you can just put it in there, wait I think it was like 15 seconds, and then it's already vaporized. Makes it so much easier for large scale beekeepers. When you have to do a lot of hives all at once. I tried another vaporizer that was just kind of like the cheap vaporizing method, and oh my gosh, it took like 20 minutes to vaporize, and I'm like, I do not have time for this. But yeah, so the other way that you can do it is also using the dribble method. This must be mixed into a solution and dripped between every frame in the hive. So for large scale beekeepers, that's kind of out of the options, just because it can be a lot of work to have to do that. Isn't really going to be efficient. But if you're just a hobbyist, this could work absolutely great for you. And it also must be used over a minimum of 4 weeks, treating 1 day a week or every 5 days, as it only kills phoretic mites on the bees. So in order for you to get all the mites, you have to wait for all of the bees to then emerge out of the cells. It can be used with the honey supers on. It was approved, and you must use protective equipment such as a gas mask, as it is not safe to inhale. You can also make use of it during a broodless period, December or January, as it will kill all of the mites on the bees, so that you don't have to do those multiple treatments. You can just do it once. And it is approved for use in organic certified apiaries. It can also be used in any temperature, and in all honesty, I don't think there's a limit that has been found for how much is too much or will harm the bees or brood. When I had first started using it, I looked it up just to play it safe, and like literally everyone's like, I don't think there's a limit. So that is also very beneficial. So when should you treat for winter? Preferably, I like to get all of my treatments done by the end of August. If I've even seen just 5 mites in a wash, I will treat, because September is when our bees are built up slightly in numbers for the goldenrod flow. So not only will the mites double with their own breeding by October, but when the colony of the bees shrink, this number could potentially triple, as there will be more mites per bee. So treat before September and then keep an eye on your mite load going into October. Okay, if you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments. And here's a video of, this was one of the years after winter time when they're cleaning out all the dead bees. And look, it's like teamwork makes the dream work. They're tossing out the dead bees from the winter time and getting the hive ready for spring. All right, so my treatment-free plan, this may have changed since I have gone through this PowerPoint. So it looks like this video has gone for about an hour, hour and a half. So I'm going to call it right here. And if you guys want to hear about my treatment-free plan and walkaway splits, let me know in the comments and I'll make another video just like this. Because I was going to start making PowerPoints because it's a really good way for me to kind of like organize a lot of my thoughts. And I will be teaching more classes in the future, so I definitely need to get on that. So if you are interested in more videos like this, please drop in the comments and let me know, and I'll definitely have more of these informative videos for you. But anyways, if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and thank you so much for watching. I hope this helps you with your overwinter process. It can be a really stressful time, especially for new beekeepers, because it's like there's so much information out there and you're so scared of losing your bees. You really just you don't want to fail. You want to succeed this year. And I just want to say that even if you fail, you learn something. So don't be afraid to try anything and just trust yourself and see what happens. Worst case, they die, and yes, you have to buy bees in the winter time, but as you've probably learned already, bees expand very, very fast. They're expendable, which I know that's not really how a lot of people like to look at it, because sometimes we can look at our bees like pets and we don't want to lose our pet. So, but anyways, I hope this was helpful, and I will see you guys in the next one. So, don't quit and be fit.